Hello, everyone, and good evening. This is the eighth episode of the podcast Geofinance. Today, we're going to discuss about the psychological effects of the crisis. It is a relatively big area, starting and engaging in debate about the behavioral economics and the psychological effects. Nevertheless, we are considering to be very interesting debate because it is never clear if psychology drives the economics or vice versa. However, let us open the debate. Ivan, hello and good evening. I hope you're
Hi,
fine.
I am.
That's nice to hear. Would you be kind to start this interesting topic? How do you see it? Do you see any important psychological effects? Certainly, there is psychological effect of this encompassing crisis.
Obviously, there's going to be a few psychological effects of the crisis. First, the pandemic itself. People are scared. Many people are scared, and they're scared of the virus. They're scared of getting sick. They're scared of potentially dying. They're scared of infecting other people. So this is going to leave a trace. This is going to leave a psychological scar on everyone. For the foreseeable future, I think that we will see a downwards trend in restaurant visits. We will see a downward trend in uh, visits to sports competitions, concerts, events like that, because many people will still be afraid, especially those who are a bit older.
Okay.
People who are more at risk, people who already have diabetes, who have heart conditions, who have various other pre-existing conditions that already affect their life expectancy.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously those people will stay at home more. They will be more scared of disease in the future, at least for a few years. And this could potentially actually be positive because they will be probably less likely to get the flu next season. They
Mm-hmm.
will be less likely to get a cold, etc. So there is actually a silver lining on that cloud. But the economic effects will be felt as well because a lot of industries depend on these consumers, depend on their money, depend on what they spend. Also, another very important aspect of the crisis is the economic consequences of the crisis. They are going to have a very profound psychological effect because people are losing their jobs and they will continue to lose their jobs not just because of the crisis but also because of the measures taken by various governments to combat the virus. So
Mm-hmm.
we have seen, for example, on Thursday, the 16th of April, we have seen new numbers, jobless claims at 5.2 million, which is a bit more than I expected.
Mm-hmm.
This means that over the previous month, 4 weeks, 22 million Americans have lost their jobs. That is a big number. 22 million people unemployed. Unemployed people don't spend much. Unemployed people try to save every penny. Unemployed people may miss rents. They may miss other payments, insurance, health insurance. This will obviously be very damaging for the economy in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that in these circumstances, in this circumstance, it will act like a self-fulfilling prophecy that people will consume less because they're afraid, which would further multiply in their expectations, and then we are going to have even more serious situation than currently is? Or do you think that behind this crisis, it is simple economic fundamentals that are leading the situation forward?
There might be a vicious circle. You're right in that regard. There might be a vicious circle in terms of people having an expectation of a worse outcome and behaving as if a worse outcome is inevitable, thereby creating that worse outcome. That is a perfectly valid theory. But There is obviously a very, very real economic reason why this recession is hitting us. It's like we said before, it's not just the virus, just the pandemic. This recession was inevitable in the sense that the economy has been over leveraged thanks to cheap money, money printing by central banks for a long time, and this bubble has to burst at some point, and it might as well be this point.
All right. What about the discussion about the recovery? So some people say it's going to be like V-shaped. Some of them say that it will be U-shaped. Some of them are afraid it's going to be L-shaped. Do you have any comment on all those shapes?
Well, that's a counterpoint, a counter argument to what you said previously. Some people expect this to be a very short recession or not even a recession at all. Some people expect the economy to go back to normal as soon as the restrictions are lifted, as soon as summer comes, or maybe in July and in August, every restriction will be lifted and people will go back to work. They think everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be normal.
But
I don't think that's the case. I don't think that
okay.
it's going to be normal. Uh, in terms of shapes, I, I don't see a V recession, a V recovery. I don't see a U recovery. Maybe lowercase L,
Okay.
but that's the best. That's the best scenario. The
Do you
worst
think
worst case scenario is obviously a capital L. That might happen.
that might happen?
Yeah.
So, do you think that, like in this situation, perhaps like companies and big industries can exploit this in various terms, in psychological terms? Can they offer something to their consumers, to their customers? Would that be like possible to cut some costs and then to provide some extra benefits so the people can calm themselves? I mean, not only like the average person who just consumes necessities, but also some industries. Can they have a little bit push towards recovery in their sectors?
Well, some sectors I think will recover relatively quickly. That is practically guaranteed by keeping people indoors for such a long time. Many countries are doing this around the world. And when this thing is over, and it will be over, sooner or later it will be over. People miss human contact.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say in Europe that cafes will, as soon as this is over, cafes will be full again. There will be more life out in the streets, so street vendors may get a lot of income from that, a lot of revenue. But overall, I doubt that the economy will bounce back so quickly, especially the companies that create more expensive, more highly complex goods, like Apple, for example, or Samsung, or any of the other electronics manufacturers, because these goods rely on very long supply chains. They rely on components coming from many countries being assembled in China or being assembled somewhere else in Asia. Those supply chains are now broken. It's gonna take a while for them to come back. It's gonna take a while for borders to open. It's gonna take a while for these supply chains to come back. Like if you remember 2011, the floods in Thailand that decimated the hard drive industry.
Mm-hmm.
It really affected the world of computers because hard drives were expensive all of a sudden, and you couldn't get one.
Mm-hmm.
And it lasted for a long time. It only relatively recently hard drives became cheaper. They were very expensive for a long time. I think that this might have a similar effect
Mm-hmm.
because many companies are thinking about relocating from China, so that's going to add time to their schedules for returning to full capacity. Many companies will be forced by their governments to return home.
Mm-hmm.
We will see. I mean, the inevitable here is the return of many companies to the United States, for example, from China, because we are now in a situation where 94% of medication used in the United States comes from China. And that's a
Okay.
very precarious position to be in. So I'm sure that the government, the US government, will require many companies, many strategically important companies to come back to the United States. And
Okay.
that will also cause some delays in the recovery. And another very important delay will obviously be AI because the jobs, they're not all coming back. Some of them will come back, but many jobs will be automated away and they're never coming back.
Okay. Is there any profession that you could like extract to be in high demand? For some reason, I think that the political risk will be increased. I think that some analysts who are dealing with the political risk and finance risk would be much in demand in years to come, in periods to come. Do you have in mind some other professions?
Well, I think doctors, epidemiologists, for example, will be very highly sought after in the
That's
immediate
a good point.
aftermath of this pandemic. Also, other types of doctors, pulmonologists, for example, because this is a coronavirus. So, one of the coronaviruses, just like the SARS virus, the MERS virus, and researchers who specialize in this type of virus, they will definitely be sought after. People who make vaccines, for example, they will be sought after. People who develop medication, pharmacologists, they will be sought after definitely after this crisis because now we are in a global rush to develop a cure, to develop a treatment, to develop a vaccine.
Hmm.
And I think everyone sees the potential for another pandemic. This
Okay.
one, I think we were lucky with this one because the death rate is actually not that high. And I mean, realistically, it's less damaging for the economy and our society if the death rate skews towards older people. It would be much more tragic, in my opinion, if younger people were more affected. They are affected, but not as much as older people.
So do you think that the society entering a new phase after this first wave, or perhaps after the second wave, would be a bit more based on hope or fear? What do you expect?
I expect the economy to implode between the first and the second stage of the disease, if there is a second stage or a second wave, as you say. If there is a significant economic downturn, then that will discourage many people. So there won't be a lot of hope. Also, in terms of fear, I see many companies already profiting from people because I have seen ads, for example, for supplements, dietary supplements, or natural remedies for the
To
for
boost
this.
the immune system.
For example, for boosting the immune system, for increasing production of vitamin D for some reason, as if we couldn't just get vitamin D tablets. There's a lot of different supplements that some people are trying to sell based on the fear of this virus. And so in that respect, yes, those companies, those industries will be very successful in the coming years. But overall, the economy, I think, will suffer greatly. And also, in terms of hope or fear, it's not fear that will remain. Fear will last for a few more months. But I already see in Europe that people are not really afraid of the virus anymore. They're tired of restrictions and lockdowns. They just want to get out. And
Mhm.
that's actually a lack of fear. They're over it. They
Right.
were afraid for a while, but now they're over it. Many people, especially younger people, are just they're saying, okay, if I need to get infected in order to get antibodies, then let's just get infected. I'll get antibodies and I get on with my life. This is a bit scary actually because other those people might infect other people who are more prone to suffering serious consequences from this disease.
I agree. Good. Interesting. So do you think that soon we might have some improvements in terms of lifting the restrictions like Austria mentioned recently, perhaps Germany? I do not know what's going on in Sweden. Some sources say that it's been a failure. Some say that it's going to be just fine. Do you have any specific country in mind when you say lifting the restrictions, discarding the fear, and moving on?
Well, I've seen such announcements from several countries. One of those countries is Austria, as you said, but also Germany, Denmark, Slovenia, Croatia. Those countries are already announcing that some measures will be lifted, some restrictions will no longer be applicable because you have to understand that it's difficult psychologically, since we're speaking about psychology, it's very difficult for someone to be indoors, to be isolated from society for months on end without a schedule, without any date, when things might go back to normal. And this is difficult psychologically for a lot of people, especially those who are more extroverted, people who are social butterflies. This is very damaging to them. Uh, the introverts among us, I think they fare better, but even for them, this is a bit extreme because in some cases people haven't been able to leave their homes for over a month at all. In some countries, people who are over 65 are not allowed to leave their homes. So this will have profound effects. Another thing that I'm very concerned about is that the governments will continue to implement some very draconian measures in terms of spying on people, in terms of surveillance,
Hmm.
in terms of wiretapping phones, accessing location data.
Hmm.
That is a big potential concern because
Certainly.
now in these many countries have declared a state of emergency, and in a state of emergency laws are passed that don't really concern themselves with human rights, with civil liberties. They're very short-sighted in that regard. They are
Hmm.
designed to be implemented for the short term. Immediately, we need to implement them now. But in the long term, I think that they will be horrible for in terms of civil liberties because in some countries, for example, we have trials over Skype. That is a
Hmm.
bad idea. We have
Hmm.
very fast trials where the defendant basically doesn't have access to a lawyer. This is very concerning. Also, we have seen various countries arrest journalists, for example, for reporting on the government's failures to combat the disease. And these repressive measures might stick around after the pandemic is over.
Which is also psychologically detrimental to decisions that came later. If you plan to make some investments, if you plan to make any other long-term plans, it might not go well if the overall political climate and security climate is a bit shaky and made on such foundations that you just expressed and explained, right? Do you think the governments could communicate better during this crisis? Do you think that they could provide some time horizon in aspect when it will end, when it will change for the better or something like that? I've seen, for example, in Greece that they're doing relatively fine in terms of coping with the crisis, in terms of communicating with the people, despite of course the issue with holidays. But again, I have the sense that they are doing pretty well in communication terms. Do you have anything to comment on this? Not specifically about the Greece, but about general situation in Europe or globally.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Greece. I can't not mention it. I think that New Democracy is much more capable of governing the country than Syriza was.
Hmm.
I think that Greece is much better off now than they were under an amateurish leftist government that wasn't really good at anything. I think New Democracy is a serious party. They have, unlike Syriza, they have some very experienced people there, very capable people. And I know that they're not universally liked, but it's still much better to have serious people in charge than to have amateurs, which Syriza were and still are.
Okay, that sounds a bit harsh, but okay.
And
Um,
in terms of other governments, many governments have taken restrictive measures to protect themselves because their initial response was nothing. They did not have one, and a lot of countries allowed themselves to be infected without appropriate measures being taken. And then the governments went into damage control mode and they introduced extremely restrictive measures, hoping to reverse the course of this situation, hoping to prevent any further infections because their reputation depends on it. Their future success in elections depends on it, and many of them were not successful at this. So I think that the 2020s will be a decade of political instability
Okay.
because
Wow. Okay.
many people are not happy with how their countries are being governed, and they will probably vote to change their governments in the next elections.
You mean like a wave of instability or like some cases that are rising one by one? How do you see that kind of instability? Do you see it like in broader aspect, so to speak, at one point in time to be like going on like some kind of situation that we had in Europe in 1820, 1830, 1840, and so on, or something a bit more?
There will be a fusion of reasons for this political instability. One of the reasons will definitely be the government's poor response to this pandemic. Another very important reason will be the economic collapse that is definitely coming, and the general unemployment, the low economic prospects of most citizens. People will not be happy about that. So, if people want to change the government for several reasons, you have multiple groups of people who are not happy. You have political opponents who are not happy who want to change the government. You have unemployed people who are not happy who want to change the government. You have people who disagree with the government's restrictive measures who want to change the government. You have, for example, dog owners who are not allowed to walk their dogs. You
Hmm.
have over 65s who are not allowed to leave their house for 2 months. You have first time voters who just do not like being told what to do, teenagers and people in their early and mid 20s. People in general don't really like being told what to do, especially if they perceive the person telling them what to do as incompetent, and many government officials are relatively incompetent.
Hmm.
So
Should
I think that there will be a wave over the next couple of years. There will be a wave of governments falling, especially in less economically prosperous regions of the world. Another very important issue here is in some countries is food security, because it's much easier to live in a country that exports food, that has plenty of food. You know, countries in Eastern Europe, for example, are good examples of this. Countries such as Russia, Ukraine, for all of its problems, Ukraine has plenty of food.
Mhm.
Belarus has plenty of food. Poland has plenty of food. Hungary, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, all of these countries have plenty of food. They are food exporters.
Ex-communist countries, which is very interesting here.
Well, they just happen to be on the in the Pannonian Plain and the North European Plain, and these parts of the world produce a lot of food. So countries
Okay.
countries that this is a quirk of geography really, but
Yes, yes.
countries that have a relatively low population, relatively low for their size, and export a lot of food are in a much better position than countries, for example, like Egypt, that have Egypt has 100 million people living in a tiny, narrow strip of land along the Nile. So Egypt already imports most of its food. Other countries, densely populated countries, Japan, South Korea, they import most of their food. Uh,
Vietnam exports it a lot, right? Vietnam has enormous size of agricultural land.
but Vietnam also has a large population, and Vietnam is actually a country that is developing pretty rapidly. So
Yes.
I I like Vietnam in terms of its economic prospects. I think that Vietnam has a bright future.
Hmm.
But there are countries in Africa, in Asia, even in Western Europe, countries that don't really have a lot of agricultural resources, food resources, and I think that there might be shortages in the years to come. So we'll see what happens. I predict some political instability in some ways.
Interesting. Basic thing, necessity, food, perhaps maybe even shelter in terms of purchasing power of citizens. So yes, definitely psychology may play an important role in this decade. Interesting. Do you see any specific country or specific example that might be very interesting to hear something about regarding our psychological vicious circle and self-fulfilling prophecy, uh, trinity, so to speak?
If interesting is the only parameter that we're looking at, I think that authoritarian, totalitarian regimes, dictatorships are going to be very interesting because
Okay.
it's like the former Soviet Union after Chernobyl. Communist countries don't really deal that well with disasters because they have to have control over everything, and if you put their incompetence up for everyone to see, then that will be terrible for them. People might rise up, people who might be hungry, people who might be unhappy with their job situation. So we'll see what happens there. I'm thinking here about North Korea, for example. I'm thinking
Mm-hmm.
about even about China. China is a large country. China has is a very powerful country. China has a huge population, a huge economy, but China will suffer greatly from this. Uh,
China has a lot of challenges, one way or another, in every
China has a lot
sense.
of challenges. Yeah, we'll talk about China's challenges in a future episode, definitely. But I see instability around the world, and in democratic countries, actually less so than in more totalitarian ones.
That's true.
But there will be a lot of instability, especially as I said before, in the Middle East, in countries that don't really have a capable, competent government.
I see. Good. Very, very nice and interesting debate. Ivan, thank you very much for presenting those conclusions. And I think that we reached some point where psychology definitely plays an important role, both in micro and macro environments. So we will discuss about the next episode in days to come. Until then, I would like to thank you very much, both to you and to our listeners, and I truly hope to hear soon from you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Have a good night, listeners. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.